All right, welcome everyone. If you are here for the discussion about building resilience with gender empowerment, sustainable food, and reuse policies, then you are in the right place. We're going to wait a few minutes to get started to give folks enough time to hop on. So thank you for your patience, and we will get started soon. If you're having any tech issues right now, please feel free to privately chat our tech support Griselda today. And thank you so much. If you're just joining us, just want to say welcome. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to join before we get started today. I look forward to this conversation. I hope you're all as excited as I am. We're just going to have a few more minutes to let people trickle in. Seems like we have a really good attendance so far. So yes, very much looking forward to getting this discussion started soon. Please hang tight. Alrighty, in the interest of respecting those who have gotten here on time, I don't want to waste any more of your time, so let's get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's presentation. Before we officially get started, let me go over a bit of housekeeping. First, everyone is muted since we have a large group today. The event will be recorded and we will email you a copy of the slides and continuing education unit form soon after the event ends. And after introductions, each panelist will have a few minutes to give a presentation. We'll do a Q&A session with a few prepared questions, and then we'll open the discussion up to questions from the audience. I'd like to encourage you all to use the question box throughout the presentation, and I will work my best to get through as many questions as we can as time will allow. So I am your moderator for today's presentation. My name is Arielle King. I am joining today's presentation from Anacostan Land in Washington, D.C. My pronouns are she, her, and for those who are unable to see me today, I'm a Black woman with an average build and my hair braided straight back, wearing large frame glasses and dual tone multicolored blouse. I am the environmental justice staff attorney at the Environmental Law Institute in Washington, D.C. Now I want to introduce our wonderful panelists for today. Marcel Howard is a policy analyst and coordinator with the nonprofit Upstream, where he develops and executes projects that address the connections between source reduction, consumption, reuse and refill, environmental justice, and the climate crisis. Prior to Upstream, Marcel worked in a variety of positions centered around climate change and environmental justice. Marcel holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Lesley University and a master's degree in environmental policy and sustainability management from the New School. Next, we have Stephanie Feldstein, who is the Population and Sustainability Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. There, she leads the center's work to highlight and address threats to endangered species and wild places from human population growth and overconsumption. Previously, Stephanie worked for change.org, where she helped hundreds of people and start and win online campaigns to protect wildlife. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and is the author of The Animal Lover's Guide to Changing the World. Last but not least, we have Kelley Dennings, who's the campaign manager with the Center for Biological Diversity, where she develops and executes advocacy and outreach initiatives that address the connections between reproductive health, gender equity, endless growth, and the climate and extinction crises. She holds a bachelor's degree in natural resources from NC State and has a master's degree in public health from the University of South Florida. Before we officially begin with today's presentation, I'm going to ask Griselda to start our first poll. So this poll is for those looking to receive continuing education units. Completing this poll allows Kelley to do the appropriate paperwork after the event. So please fill out that first poll. Excellent. And for our second poll, we would like to just get a feel for who is joining us on this call today. So are you with a nonprofit, a for-profit entity, government, a school or university? Are you joining as an individual or other are the options. Right. Excellent. I get the sense that there is a little bit of everyone here, and that's what we like to see. So yes, thank you. Thank you so much. All right, so now I am going to be handing the floor over to Marcel. And so it is your time. Thank you so much for being here, Marcel.
Thank you so much, Arielle. I really appreciate that. Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. And as mentioned, my name is Marcel Howard, and I'm the policy analyst and coordinator here at Upstream. I currently reside in New York City on the Lenape land, and I'm a biracial cisgendered gay male with short hair and use he, him pronouns. It's great to be here today. Today, I'll be covering the opportunity and benefits that exist for reuse solutions to be embedded within climate plans across the country, as reuse solutions offer a movement away from the current one-way throwaway economic model that embraces and rewards the production and consumption of single-use products and packaging. Next slide, please. Since our beginning, Upstream had recognized that managing waste once it's created is not the way to address the ever-increasing quantity of waste being generated. While recycling and composting are better forms of waste management, we have always focused on upstream solutions that prevent waste before it's created. We do this through the avenues of business innovation, social impact, and policy change. And like our founder, Bill Sheehan, once said, we're never going to be able to recycle or compost our way to a sustainable future. We have to work upstream to redesign the systems generating all the waste in the first place. Next slide, please. So before we jump into all the details, it's important to understand what a climate plan actually is. Now, more than 600 local governments across the United States have adopted their own climate plans. And these plans help bridge the gap between climate mitigation and climate adaptation, creating climate resilience. Climate resilience focuses on creating actions to reduce emissions that cause climate change and managing the risk of existing climate change impacts. As these plans have been developed over the years, new mitigation and adaptation opportunities have presented themselves to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the impacts of climate change. 3 of these opportunities include reuse solutions, sustainable food, and gender empowerment. Next slide, please. Now, climate plans are designed to be robust in nature and to address the true amount of emissions being emitted by the residents of a particular jurisdiction. However, most existing climate plans fall short of adequately accounting for the true greenhouse gas emissions because they do not use consumption-based emissions inventories, or CBEIs. Instead, existing plans prioritize sector-based emissions inventories, which account for emissions created within a jurisdiction and for exported goods and services. However, they fail to account for the emissions of goods and services being imported into a jurisdiction. So for example, if we're in the state of Minnesota, the life cycle emissions from the turkey that went from New York to Minnesota, or excuse me, to New York from Minnesota aren't counted in a consumption-based emissions inventory, but the life cycle emissions from a coat made in China and bought in Minnesota are. So CBIs cover the emissions from anywhere in service of things consumed in Minnesota in this case, while sector-based account for only the emissions produced in Minnesota, regardless of where things are consumed. So for products and packaging, those that are imported into a jurisdiction, as many products are these days, the consumption-related emissions of those products are not accounted for when using only a sector-based emissions approach. And this can have vast effects on the emissions being accounted for a jurisdiction. As one C40 study showed that greenhouse gas emissions are as much as 60% higher than currently estimated when using a consumption-based emissions inventory. Next slide, please. So now that we have a quick understanding of what climate plans and CBIs are, it's very important to understand the key challenges facing the world today regarding plastics and climate change. So first, global carbon emissions have significantly increased by about 90% since 1970 and are continuing to increase. A population of nearly 8 billion and growing is embracing a throwaway economy centered around single-use products and packaging, which is not sustainable. We also have the throwaway economy causing more than over 150 million metric tons of plastic to be in our ocean. And lastly, these issues are only being exacerbated by the further expansion of the plastics industry, specifically fueling a petrochemical infrastructure build out, which disproportionately affects Black and brown, low income, and indigenous communities. These are just a few of the key challenges that the throwaway economy has created, and these challenges are vastly contributing to the climate and plastics problem the world is currently facing. Next slide, please. While single-use packaging is used for all kinds of consumer products, food and beverage packaging have shown to be a major contributor to the plastics problem. First, the data shows that food and beverage packaging escapes the waste management system and into the environment more than any other product type. While as an individual item, cigarette butts have always topped the charts of coastal cleanup day data, looking more closely, we see that grouped together, about 75% of the top 10 littered items are food and beverage packaging. Meanwhile, other litter studies also show that about 70% of the products that are littered in city streets is comprised of single-use food and beverage packaging. Next slide, please. Now, recycling and composting are often offered as valuable solutions for food packaging. However, there's a lot of mythology around the potential of these solutions. We know that most recovered materials are downcycled or end up in landfill or incineration, like foodware, because they are too contaminated to be recycled into new products. Plus, only 5% of all plastic waste ever created has been recycled, the majority of which is only soda and water bottles. In addition, compostable products are also a bit of a myth. For compost plastics, even certified compostable plastics, they contaminate compost, which lowers the overall quality of compost, making most commercial composters not want the product in the first place. Plastic compostable products are often selected out of the compost piles and are sent into landfills, where it has 30 times more greenhouse gas impact than packaging that is composted. So recycling and composting are solutions for certain materials, but they are not the best overall solution to plastic pollution and the ever-increasing single-use packaging waste stream. Next slide, please. Now, when we think about the one-way throwaway culture and what we need to do to change it, most people immediately think about banning plastics in general. There is over 150 million metric tons of plastics in our oceans as of 2015, and that problem continues to grow. However, the question I'd like you to think about is whether banning single-use plastic is the right solution. The consequences of only focusing on one material type is that the alternative single-use materials have a host of environmental and human health impacts. That means we're really just shifting impacts from single-use disposables to their alternatives. The alternative use materials can be just as devastating and sometimes worse. Other single-use materials cause pollution, exacerbate climate change, extract precious and limited natural resources, propel loss of biodiversity, and even threaten human health. In these ways, they are regrettable substitutes. These regrettable substitutes demonstrate that the problem isn't just plastic, but it's single use itself. Next slide, please. At Upstream, we believe reuse solutions offer a significant opportunity to move away from the traditional one-way throwaway economic model and towards a just and equitable circular economy. So how does reusable foodware help solve the climate and plastics crisis? Well, reusable food serviceware beats single-use alternatives through every environmental measure, from climate, water, land use, to pollution. Reusables hit a break-even point where they outperform the disposables, and the benefits to the environment accrue with each additional use past that point. In addition, reuse protects the climate. Over the life cycle, reusable food and beverage packaging has lower greenhouse gas emissions compared to the better disposable alternatives. Non-toxic reuse helps reduce overall pollution, chemical exposure, and litter, and can also greatly improve the overall living conditions of a community while reducing the overall litter and waste management costs for local businesses and government. Reuse can help turn off the tap for single-use plastics as well, as it reduces the demand for single-use products. It can reduce the need to expand production operations that disproportionately affect Black and brown, low-income, and indigenous communities living on the fence line of industry. And lastly, reuse services create good local jobs. Replacing just 20% of single-use packaging with reusable alternatives offers an opportunity worth at least $10 billion. The logistics of reusable collection, washing, and redistribution provide safe local jobs, whereas disposable-related jobs are in other locales where extraction, production, and disposal take place. With reuse solution, next slide, please. Thank you. With reuse solutions offering significant benefits over disposables, we wanted to learn more about the opportunity that exists for reuse solutions to be embedded within climate plans as low-hanging fruit climate mitigation strategies. So we performed an analysis of 52 climate plans from across the country to understand where source reduction and reuse language has already been adopted in order to help mitigate the climate effects of the one-way throwaway economic model. And this map is just an analysis or showcasing the breadth and scope of those plans throughout the country. Next slide, please. The climate plan analysis shows the opportunity that exists within plans for embedding consumption reduction and reuse concepts. Currently, only 19 of the 52 climate plans analyzed include language around both consumption reduction and reuse. Although further analysis is needed, one can assume this trend would continue when reviewing additional climate plans across the country. The missing language presents a strong opportunity to introduce consumption reduction and reuse concepts as low-hanging fruit mitigation strategies, which would help cities and municipalities reduce the additional greenhouse gas emissions that they would ultimately find by using a consumption-based emissions inventory. Some of the cities that included this model language for consumption reduction included Boston, Minneapolis, Pittsburgh, and Victoria, British Columbia. And for reuse and refill language, we have Chicago, Jersey City, New Orleans, and St. Louis, just to name a few. Next slide, please. Now, the climate plan strategies vary widely among plans, but a few cities have proposed model language that should be highlighted. First, the city and county of LA adopted specific reuse targets to help them achieve their climate goals. Like one, increase the proportion of waste products and recyclables productively reused and are repurposed within LA County to at least 25% by 2025 and 50% by 2035. And their second goal of reducing municipal solid waste generation per capita by at least 15% by 2030, including phasing out single-use plastics by 2028. Secondly, we have the city of Philadelphia, who updated their climate plan in 2021 to prioritize reuse pilot and education programs to engage residents, businesses, and institutions in reducing consumption and expanding circular materials management systems. And lastly, we have San Francisco, where they made a commitment that by 2030, through a combination of policy, education, outreach, and new infrastructure solutions, they would cut its generation of discards by 15%. Next slide, please. Now, moving forward, it's clear that source reduction and reuse solutions offer an opportunity to help mitigate some of the impacts for climate change. And the connection between these concepts and climate is strong. So moving forward and based off this analysis, we'd recommend the following. Using consumption-based emissions inventories in conjunction with sector-based emissions inventories for the true account of greenhouse gas emissions from products and packaging. Work within existing climate plan structures to embed source reduction and reuse concepts. In addition to that, we advocate for identifying and implementing specific source reduction and reuse targets like they did in LA County. Educate and train government staff on reuse solutions and their connection to climate change, as well as prioritizing reuse as one pathway towards a just and equitable transition away from the extractive, one-way, throwaway economic model we currently have. So with that, I'll go ahead and close out my presentation and looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you so much, Arielle.
Excellent, thank you. So I do want to remind everyone that if you have questions for individual panelists or for all of the panelists, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. So next we have Stephanie. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Glad you could join us today. I am Stephanie Feldstein, and I'm a white woman wearing glasses with long brown hair, and I'm sitting in a home office with books and pictures of wolves behind me. And today I am presenting from the Pacific Northwest on occupied cowlitz land. Next slide, please. I am with the Center for Biological Diversity. The center is a nonprofit organization that uses science, the law, policy advocacy, organizing, and creative media to save life on Earth. Over the past 30 plus years, we've secured protections for more than 700 endangered species and hundreds of millions of acres of critical habitat. And next slide, please. Today, I'm here to talk about food as climate policy. For a long time, food and agriculture were left out of climate discussions and left out of climate targets. And that's a big mistake, because research has shown that even if we went climate neutral tomorrow in the energy sector, which of course should happen, we still wouldn't meet global climate targets if we don't also address emissions in food and agriculture, and particularly those coming from meat and dairy production. And that's because food systems are responsible for more than 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, and about half of that comes just from meat and dairy production. Meat and dairy production are also associated with a whole host of other environmental threats like air and water pollution, high levels of water use, as well as a lot of threats that are related to the climate crisis affecting your communities like drought, wildfires, and biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. Food and agriculture is particularly important, and especially meat and dairy, because of methane. And methane has been getting a lot of attention over the past year from IPCC, United Nations, and governments, including our own federal government, making methane reduction pledges, because methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. It's significantly more potent than CO2 over a 20-year period, but it also doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long, which means that as we are headed toward these climate change tipping points, reducing methane emissions can help us more quickly reach our emissions reductions targets, as we're also working on these long-term emissions reductions as well. And it also, the reverse of that is also true, which means that if we don't address methane and we allow it to continue to increase, then that will just push us further towards those tipping points, and it will accelerate global warming. So animal agriculture is one of the largest sources of methane in the US. And it's important to note that a big part of that comes from beef alone. And I just want to call out beef because as you are looking at how to integrate these shifts towards reducing food-related emissions, beef is a really good place to prioritize in order to have even more rapid reductions and to see those faster results in your food-related emissions. Next slide, please. A study from University of Michigan and Tulane found that if US diets cut 90% of beef and 50% of other meat and dairy products and replace them with plant-based foods, we would save more than 2 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And that same study also found that if we just continued the American diet as usual, that by 2030, emissions would rise by 9%, pushing us in the wrong direction. I also want to flag here that when we talk about prioritizing reducing beef, we're talking about switching from beef to plant-based foods such as beans, tofu, or even other types of the beef alternatives that are plant-based. Whatever works for you and your community, but not switching to other animal products, because other animal products are still responsible for significantly higher greenhouse gas emissions than plant-based foods. Next slide, please. I also want to briefly touch on food waste here. Food waste tends to be kind of an easy move because food waste is not a controversial issue compared to sometimes how people respond to other kinds of dietary shifts. And it can have good payoffs when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So along with some of the things I'll talk about in terms of helping to shift diets and move toward more climate-friendly food and agriculture, addressing food waste and setting food waste reduction targets is also a really good goal to reduce your food-related emissions. Next slide, please. So I want to talk in more detail about some of those recommendations. And there are 4 priority areas that we have identified. And these are all things that can happen either within climate plans or even outside of climate plans. While that planning process is happening, these are things that can occur in regular city or institutional policy as well. The first one is focusing on food procurement, and those are your purchasing policies. And we recommend setting emissions reduction targets for those policies, as well as specific targets for reducing meat and dairy purchases. And of course, those things go hand in hand because as you reduce your meat and dairy purchases, you will see those emissions overall dropping related to your food purchases. Alongside with that, as I mentioned, it's important to increase plant-based foods to make sure that those foods are available and accessible to people. One model for that is called default veg. And that basically refers to right now, most places, when you walk into a cafeteria or a restaurant or an event, the default is that the entrees come with meat on them. And if you don't want meat, you have to request the meat to be removed. And this just flips that on its head so that when you walk into those spaces, the default of the entrees is that they are vegetarian or plant-based, and people can request to add meat. And initial studies have shown that when that happens, many more people choose to stay with that plant-based option. So that's one way that you can approach that. The second area is community engagement. It's really important that folks from agencies who are doing purchases to the restaurant community to the general public have an increased understanding of the support that they need in order to have these dietary shifts. That includes things like making sure that agencies have the resources of knowing where to purchase more plant-based foods, that restaurants and caterers know how to make delicious plant-based menus. That's not something that is always inherent knowledge to folks, so that helps make it really appealing to people and gets a lot of support for these shifts. And public education can help people improve their cooking skills. It can help people learn how to garden and help people learn the connections between climate-friendly food, nutrition, and even culturally appropriate foods and what that looks like. I'm not sure if we lost Kelley for a second here, but I will keep going with talking through my recommendations. And as we said at the beginning, you will get a copy of these slides, so you'll be able to see all of what I'm talking about as we go along. The third bucket that I want to talk about in terms of recommendations is supporting climate-friendly local producers. Even if you don't have a lot of agriculture in your area, you likely have a lot of people who are growing food on a small scale, who are producing food, who are serving food. And this is really an opportunity to support Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are in those businesses, who are growers, who are restaurateurs, caterers, et cetera. There's also an opportunity in here to support a lot of community and school gardens. And those are great opportunities, one, to connect people with their food. They're great educational opportunities, but they're also an excellent opportunity to make fresh foods more accessible to people. That if people are growing it in their own backyards, in their communities, in their schools, it means that they have more access to that fresh produce. And along those lines, we've seen some really great, innovative proposals around using city-owned land and taking, underutilized parcels within cities and turning them over into community gardens and into these garden spaces, which is a great way to, again, increase that access to food, but also reduce pollution and create green spaces in the city. And finally, just want to mention sustainable food task force or food policy councils. And this is an opportunity for you to form a group that really runs across stakeholders in your community. And that includes, again, those growers and business owners, but also people who are working on this from an environmental perspective and people who are, working to fight hunger in your community, and really to bring all these folks together to help problem solve these issues in collaborative and creative ways. Next slide, please. And finally, I want to talk real quick about what some of those model policies look like, because some of these already exist in other cities. You don't have to recreate the wheel here. A few that I just want to touch on is the C40 Good Food Cities Declaration is focused on achieving plant-forward diets by 2030, and that one also addresses food waste. The Good Food Purchasing Standards allows you to bring in some of the other values that are important to you and your communities. That includes things like local economies, animal welfare, a valued workforce, and nutrition alongside the sustainability standards. And finally, the Cool Food Pledge is another framework to reduce the climate impact of food served 25% by 2030. And we see some cities and institutions using a combination of those because they really do work hand in hand. And I also have a link on this slide, that I'd love to mention. I recommend you check out New York City just recently released a food and climate dashboard, which is a great interactive dashboard that shows like by food type and agency, what the emissions associated are with different foods. So they are not only being transparent about their progress, which is always a fantastic move, but also allows you to kind of see where there can be the most gains in emissions reductions. And even from the snapshot, you can see that that is primarily in beef and dairy in this particular snapshot. And next slide, please. And finally, before I pass it over to Kelley to talk about gender equity in plans, I also want to point out the health and equity benefits of this focus on climate-friendly food. When you increase access to healthy plant-based foods, you are reducing risks of diet-related disease, you are helping make more culturally diverse and culturally appropriate foods available, and you're also helping improve food and nutrition security through that increased access to that healthy, fresh food. And by supporting climate-friendly agriculture, you're also helping to reduce agricultural pollution. You're improving food sovereignty, again, as people have that access to food that they themselves can grow and they can control where their food comes from. And finally, you are supporting overall community resilience, because not only are you improving health and improving the environment of your community, but you are also creating more food production that requires fewer resources and that allows for a greater diversity of food production, which all leads towards greater resilience. And with that, I will turn it over to Kelley.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie, Marcel, Arielle. I apologize for that small glitch right there with the slides. So good on that, Stephanie. I feel like you kept going, but I am going to keep my my camera off for now so that I hopefully get through this. My apologies, y'all. So my name's Kelley Dennings. My pronouns are she and her. For those that are unable to see me today, I'm a petite, also could say short, white middle-aged woman with long brown hair standing in my dining room. I want to acknowledge that I'm on stolen Miccosukee and Cherokee land where many individuals have faced displacement and suffering and hope one day they receive restorative measures. I'm going to be sharing some information about a new report just out titled Gender in the Climate Crisis, Equitable Solutions for Climate Plans. So hopefully Griselda can help me put that in the chat. So Project Drawdown is a national leader in ranking climate solutions, and they list education of women and girls and access to family planning as top climate change solutions. They note that women with bodily autonomy to choose if and when to have children, and those with more years of education have fewer and healthier children and actively manage their reproductive health. Educated girls realize higher wages and greater upward mobility. And if you're in the climate movement, I'm assuming you may be familiar with this resource. So as Marcel and Stephanie have mentioned, the effects of rising greenhouse gas emissions are more harmful to certain individuals, specifically women, gender diverse people, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color, although these communities contribute less to climate change. So this really underscores the need to include gender frameworks and gender diverse voices from communities of color into climate planning. And I know it's easy to kind of maybe see how the solutions to overcome issues involving food and plastic relate to the work for those of you that are on the phone today, but our lives are not lived in silos. So I grabbed a couple of quotes here that just spoke to me. So as Chief Seattle said, all things are bound together and all things are connected. Or Martin Luther King Jr., who said, whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. And at the center, we see the connection between gender justice and climate justice, reproductive justice and environmental justice, and these co-benefits of the solutions that help people and the planet. So similar to Marcel, we somewhat collaborated on our work. The Center for Biological Diversity sought to learn if gender frameworks were included in municipal climate plans. So we read 21 climate plans from cities across the United States, and that analyzed about 10% of the US population. So that's kind of what I'm showing here on my map. And the pressure from population growth makes it harder to meet emission reduction targets while magnifying climate change's detrimental consequences on humans and other species. So while addressing population growth is a long-term mitigation strategy, there are short-term adaptation benefits, including improved healthcare, empowerment, and other positive social outcomes. So if you remember that slide Marcel had at the beginning, it really can address mitigation and adaptation. So Our analysis looked for gender-based empowerment solutions in municipal climate plans, and gender empowerment initiatives include universal access to voluntary modern family planning, LGBTQIA+ inclusive and medically accurate comprehensive sex education, and affordable sexual and reproductive health care. But additional solutions include supporting educational opportunities, redefining gender roles, creating equitable opportunities for women, and guaranteeing safety from harassment and violence. So unfortunately, none of the climate plans we reviewed mentioned family planning, contraception, reproductive health, and only one had a mention of a gender solution. And in addition to the 21 plans that were analyzed, we did 7 informal interviews with sustainability professionals to determine why gender equity and empowerment have been left out of climate plans. And the following themes were identified. 1, gender empowerment. Oops, sorry, was I supposed to be? No, I don't have a slide for this, sorry. 1, gender empowerment solutions can be difficult to measure, and we all know the saying, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. The need for government approval for a plan can be a barrier to including gender empowerment in plans. And it matters who's at the table. Marcel mentioned this. Having diverse views represented in the discussion and decision-making throughout the development of climate plans is crucial. And finally, there was a little bit of hope that maybe the pandemic is going to offer an opportunity for folks to be building more inclusive climate plans going forward. So, similar to Marcel and Stephanie, there's some recommendations that we have for, including gender empowerment. So based on the literature and this qualitative and quantitative analysis, we recommend the following steps and policies be implemented at local government level. 1, work within the existing climate plan structures to address gender inequity as a public health issue. 2, collect relevant data related to gender, race, and climate change. Again, that measurement piece. 3, educate and train government staff on gender inclusion and the climate crisis. And 4, create gender advisory committees. And our 5th recommendation was to actually build these gender empowerment solutions that include offering comprehensive sex ed, supporting contraception access, keeping abortion legal, providing period products, funding quality education programs for women and girls, and addressing racial inequity in schools. We really feel that by implementing these practices, policymakers will be better able to create intersectional climate plans that support their communities, wildlife, and the planet. And finally, you're going to see and get an evaluation from us at the end where you're going to be able to provide some of this, but I think all of us would be interested in working with communities to integrate these topics into your plans. So please feel free to reach out to any of us after this. All right, I am going to stop sharing our screen and turn it over to you, Arielle, and hope that my internet stays.
Okay, well, fingers crossed. So we have a few questions prepared for the panelists. So I'm going to go through those as quickly as we can, recognizing that there are quite a few questions from the audience. So I want to try to get to as many of those as possible as well. So first, Marcel, what are some of the key disproportionate impacts created by the production, consumption, and disposal of disposable products and packaging?
Yeah, great question. So, there's a lot of impacts here, but trying to keep it brief in the interest of time. Climate change and plastics production disproportionately affect Black and Brown, low-income, and Indigenous communities by far. For example, 90% of the plastic pollution from manufacturing in the United States is only released into just 18 communities located mostly in Louisiana and Texas. Oftentimes, these same communities are dependent on single-use materials due to economic challenges as well, and are often inundated with litter in streets and waterways during that consumption phase. And then you also have the disposal and end of life. Many times you see these days it's centered around incineration and chemical recycling as it breaks through the environmental space. And EPA reported actually that I think it was 5.9 million metric tons of CO2 is released through plastic incineration alone. which is typically located in these communities. So in addition to those emissions, they also bring thousands of diesel trucks to transport that waste, also exposing residents to toxic air emissions and leading to a host of health impacts. So all the way from extraction to end of life, there are major impacts that are disproportionately felt by, again, Black and Brown, low income and Indigenous communities. And that's just a few.
Thank you for that information. And just you went over it so quickly. Would you mind just repeating that statistic about the 18 communities, please? Make sure everyone gets that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So just again, 90% of the plastic pollution from manufacturing is released just into 18 communities within the United States. And mostly those are located in Louisiana and Texas. And those are majority minority communities and also majority low income communities as well along the Gulf Coast.
Thank you. Selfishly, that was mostly for me because I wanted to write it down. Thank you. All right, Stephanie, your question is, what is the role of regenerative agriculture in climate plans and procurement policies?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that we are seeing come up a lot these days because there's a lot of attention being paid on regenerative agriculture, both in the food movement as well as we're seeing, major companies coming out and making these regenerative pledges. And there are absolutely better and worse ways that we can produce food, and we need to move away from this industrialized system that we have. But also, when it comes specifically to, a lot of the attention is on regenerative meat. And when we're talking about regenerative beef, there are still severe limitations to how much that can benefit the climate. There are limitations to how much carbon can be sequestered in soil and for how long, and how much that can actually offset the methane emissions from the animals, et cetera. And we also find that even within these best practices, they're really only feasible if we also significantly reduce our meat and dairy consumption. And that's because right now, if we were to switch the US beef production entirely to a grass-fed system, we would only be able to produce about 27% of our current beef supply on existing pasture land. So we should be paying attention to, how we're producing food. That is important, but none of that is really feasible unless we have those drastic reductions in meat and dairy, and unless we shift what we are eating first.
Thank you. Next question is for Kelley. Your report showed that many climate plans mention vulnerable populations more generally. Why do you feel that gender needs to be specifically mentioned in this type of work?
Yeah, well, Marcel touched on this a little bit in his remarks, but including vulnerable populations is important in a climate plan. But we really feel that if it isn't narrowed down further to the people included in those groups, we don't really think it's enough. So there are plenty of stories highlighting the disproportionate impact of, the climate crisis on women in the United States. As heat and air pollution increase due to climate change, so do adverse pregnancy outcomes that often have lifelong consequences. So for example, 27% of women firefighters' pregnancies end in miscarriage, and those women's preterm birth rate is almost 7% higher than the national average. And extreme weather events can limit access to abortion and contraception, making reproductive justice and autonomy over whether to become pregnant more difficult. Hurricane Katrina caused disruption in family planning services for young women in New Orleans, even 5 to 6 months after the storm. So, 4% experienced an unintended pregnancy because they couldn't access care. And as noted earlier, these effects are just more prevalent for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and who often live near those under-resourced, polluted communities that Marcel mentioned.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to this question, someone in the chat asked which policy included gender in their plan. So would you be able to share which one of the plans you identified as that?
Yeah, so Boston is one of the climate plans of the ones that we reviewed that included a gender equity solution, which was to expand biking classes to women and gender non-conforming individuals to improve and expand active transportation infrastructure. So while most climate plans currently lack the gender equity solutions, some communities have started to gather the gender-specific data and include that in their climate planning process, which was one of those recommendations I mentioned. So, for example, San Antonio is collecting survey responses data by gender and is planning to include pregnant people as a diverse stakeholder in their climate planning process. And the city of Boston is planning to track the percentage of women in building trades, such as facilities management, green building, and construction, hoping to increase gender equity and workforce diversity. So those were some of the examples that we saw. Not very many solutions, but at least some folks are actually tracking the data.
Excellent, thank you. Stephanie, we have a question for you. One, what is the difference in CO2 emissions between poultry and egg consumption, if you know? And then someone asked why the percentage and emissions from dairy are so high. So I figured those two questions might go hand in hand.
Yeah, those are great questions. So among animal-based proteins, eggs are typically the lowest emissions, but they are still more than twice as high as plant-based proteins like tofu, lentils, beans, and that sort of thing. Chicken is slightly higher than eggs, and those are quite a bit lower than as you start to move up into larger animals who require more resources. When you look at dairy, since dairy comes from cattle, as I mentioned, cattle are particularly bad for the climate because their digestive system emits methane. It's called enteric fermentation. And just the way that they digest, lawmakers like to joke about it sometimes that it's like, oh, we're talking about cow burps and farts. And it's like, but that's true. Like there's a lot of methane that comes out through cow burps. And so since dairy is also coming from cattle, that's why there are so much higher emissions that are associated with dairy. And in addition, cattle also require a lot more land and produce a lot more manure. So really across the board, they are just larger animals who are greenhouse gas emission machines.
Thank you. Yeah, it's as simple as that, really. Thank you. So the next question is for Marcel. Someone asked, what metrics are used to quantify reuse related to number of programs or volume or weight, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are multiple avenues to sort of quantify reuse solutions. I'll just name off a few. I think the biggest one initially is the number of reuses required to be defined reuse. I think that's the biggest way to quantify the impact of reuse, whether it's 1,000 reuses are required to be defined as reuse or 750, whatever it may be. In addition to that, Upstream usually looks at the number of programs and the number of policies being implemented throughout the country, understanding the impacts from that standpoint, as well as a few other more basic ways to quantify those measurements or the impact, including the overall decrease in overall waste being created, because really reuse solutions focuses on source reduction, so reducing the waste from being, or stopping the waste from being created in the first place. We also look at infrastructure build out and expansion into new communities, particularly those disproportionately affected, as you mentioned earlier, as well as opportunities such as greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So looking at the impacts from switching 100% from disposables to reusables for restaurants, for example, and understanding the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from that switch. So those are just a few ways that we sort of quantify reuse from Upstream's perspective.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is for Kelley. So someone asked, do you see any support or mention of breastfeeding friendly or normalization policies as a strategy in any of the plans that you were reading through?
No, we didn't, but that would be a good idea and good metric. It is just interesting to have to figure out where to get this data, because it's not in the typical sustainability, climate, purview perhaps of somebody that is normally writing these plans. And so it would include maybe your workforce development, your chamber, your public health department, kind of going and getting this data from other places that may not typically be where you go. And hopefully those folks are at the table as you're writing the climate plan, so that they're already kind of coming with some of this baseline data of like, oh, we're in a contraceptive desert. It's really hard for people to have bodily autonomy in our community. And so, those would be kinds of the things that people would be bringing to the table. Well, what does it look like if you're pregnant and you're in an extreme weather event? How would we be building out programs for that? So yeah, no, breastfeeding, great. That was not on my mind, but I will put that as a recommendation because pregnant people were, but breastfeeding wasn't. So thank you for that.
Excellent. Next question is for Stephanie. One of the viewers is a vegetarian who loves hearing about the default veg idea, and they're curious about your thoughts on methane capture or anaerobic digestion systems to cut down on methane emissions from food waste that will still make it to landfills. You have any thoughts on that, Stephanie?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. First, when it comes to food waste, similar to the philosophy that Marcel was talking about, is we really urge folks to prioritize on prevention, on better tracking and better monitoring in the first place to prevent as much as possible. A lot of efforts now on food waste. We did an analysis of grocery stores, for example, and most of them would brag about their food waste being that they either donate the food, which food donations are not actually a solution to hunger and wealth inequity. And they would brag about like composting it, which all of that is very like end of cycle. So we want to first move food waste as far upstream as we can in order to prevent it in the first place. But when it comes to food that inevitably will be wasted, I think that there is some potential in these technologies that can capture methane. The concern with it from the policy perspective is that what we're seeing right now is that these methane capture solutions are being touted as the only solution, or they're being incentivized. So when you start to put a dollar value on the methane that you can capture, you're basically just creating another unsustainable greenhouse gas. You're creating a market for it. So we just want to be careful that when we are talking about this from the policy level, that we are using it as a tool that's kind of a last kind of a last resort for how we can capture that remaining methane, but being careful not to monetize it because we don't want to incentivize creating more methane.
Excellent. Next, the question is for Marcel. Cost of land, cost of commercial space is and has driven much of the resale, repair, and reuse business. Are you seeing any policies that support rent protection or public-private partnerships in finding space for repair, resale, and reuse businesses?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question and brings up a really good point. I think initially, just off the top of my head, I am not familiar with any programs that focus or prioritize finding space for those types of businesses. I think typically, and this is something that Upstream is advocating for on the government side, there are sort of three initial things that government entities could do to help push reuse solutions forward. One is education and outreach on why reuse is the solution and why it wins, and that's to all constituencies, environmental justice groups, restaurant associations, businesses, et cetera. The second is providing direct funding for reuse infrastructure to be built within their jurisdictions. You're seeing some grant programs starting to pop up around the country, very similar to the question that's being asked, that is allowing for the expansion of reuse infrastructure and providing opportunities, particularly in disproportionately affected communities when regarding climate change impacts. And then the third thing, in addition to providing funding, is also for governments to lead by example. A simple model policy that we push forward many times is switching to a reuse-based procurement model for all government facilities. So not only are you pushing these models outside, but the government's also leading by example and instituting these same policies within their facilities. And that also can include, and we encourage them to include facilities that they may be dealing with in partnership or whatever whatever events they may be putting on at a temporary location that maybe is not their facility, we still push them to have that policy across those events as well. So very good question. A lot of work that needs to be done, but those are sort of the three ways we're pushing government, and that funding piece is a huge, huge piece for reuse.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, I recognize that there are many questions in the Q&A section. And so I recognize that there's going to be follow-up emails. And so I'm sure that the presenters will be interested in answering follow-up questions kind of on an individual basis afterward. But I do want to ask every panelist a final question, which is, what climate solutions are you inspired by right now? And so, Kelley, would you mind sharing some of the climate solutions or things happening in the world of climate and environmental work that are inspiring you at the moment?
Yeah, well, as somebody who doesn't feel like they necessarily sit in the climate world per se, but see this connection, I would say, and it's something I want to reflect on more deeply because it's a good headspace for me to be in the hopeful headspace. I think those of us working on sexual and reproductive health and rights specifically are really concerned about this decision coming out around Roe v. Wade and how that may impact other things. But with that, I would say that the movement is really alive to fight for bodily autonomy, to fight for equity and justice, to fight for the right to protect when you start a family as, your decision, and that we would fight to protect or fight to overturn these oppressive systems that impact the environment, climate, when you start a family, all of those things. So yeah, I think movement and energy within the sexual and reproductive health and rights community is motivating me.
Excellent, thank you. Marcel, what is inspiring you in the world of climate and environmental work right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. At Upstream, we try to always prioritize the solutions versus the problems, and this really goes up that same alleyway. I think for me, the biggest thing coming from a minority majority community in Southeast Virginia, and having been embedded in the environmental justice community for years in my professional life, I think for me, that's the biggest hope, is the fact that I'm seeing massive organizations, environmental organizations of all sizes, really starting to incorporate equity and justice principles and concepts within their work, understanding the impact and a great local knowledge that comes from engaging with these local communities and groups, and the positive impact that can have on the overall work that these orgs are doing. And so that for me is giving me the most hope, and I'm just really excited to see where it takes us as a movement. And I'm really hoping we can continue to understand that it takes everyone together in order to help fight the battles of climate change, not just a few selective groups.
Absolutely, thank you for that. And Stephanie, what inspires you in the world of climate and environmental work right now?
Yeah, there's a lot that I could choose from, but I guess keeping with my theme on this webinar around food, I'm really excited about the food sovereignty movement. I mean, this is a movement that really is helping folks reconnect with traditional foods, reconnect with their food ways, with not just like what they're eating, but how it's grown, how it's used in culture, how it's shared among community. And it's also critically important because not only a lot of these traditional diets tend to be more plant-based to start with, which obviously has climate benefits, as we've been talking about, but it's also a really strong way to reclaim our food from this industrial food system. And you're seeing people who are, saving seeds, who are, regenerating these crops and foods that have been missing for so many years because all of the land and all of the seeds have been bought up by these major agrochemical companies. And so this is really a way to completely change the narrative and to completely, change how we're eating and how we relate to food. And I think that's just been a really exciting way to build community as we are also fighting climate change and as we're also protecting the environment. And, the possibilities of it are just endless. I mean, there's like 400 different kinds of beans out there and only like, 5 or 6 kinds of meat that people eat. And there's just like so much richness out there that we can tap into in this. And it's really a way, I think, for people to bring, connection and joy to their activism.
Absolutely. I'm real big into joy and activism. It's so important. It's really the only way that we'll sustain this work. And so in closing, I want to thank our panelists, Kelley, Marcel, and Stephanie, for participating in today's presentation. Your work is so necessary. And so thank you for sharing your insights and your expertise with us today. And thank you to those who are watching this presentation. Be on the lookout for a follow-up email from the center that will include the slides from today's webinar, a recording with closed captions and transcripts, continuing education unit forms, or a certificate that you can submit to your various credentialing bodies, additional resources, and ways to stay engaged with the Center for Biological Diversity. So when you close out of this webinar, you can choose the option to complete a short evaluation. Please do so if you're able. And finally, I want to thank you all so much for attending and have a wonderful rest of your day.